This episode is brought to you by Education Perfect, a complete teaching and learning toolkit built to support Canadian classrooms. Education Perfect empowers educators to track progress, personalize learning, and support purposeful practice. It's easy to use, flexible, and designed to help Canadian teachers amplify their impact in the classroom. See for yourself and book a free demo today at educationperfect.com.
In Mooresville, we had an alternative school of about 100 students, 50 to 100 students, most who had some legal issues. A lot of them had probation officers. The principal was a great principal. He goes, but now, he said, let me tell you something. These kids are good kids. And he would say, we love them across that graduation line. That's how we get them there. We love them across the line. And he did.
There are times when you admire a leader from afar, and then when you get up close, they change the way you think by just how they show up and how they treat everybody around them. Dr. Mark Edwards is one of those leaders. I got to know Mark during my time with Discovery Education, when we'd bring school district teams to Mooresville, North Carolina, to see what a district committed to equity, innovation, and care could look like. It wasn't just the one-to-one laptops or the academic games that stood out. It was a culture. You could feel it, and at the center of all was Mark. And as you'll hear in this conversation, he always gives credit to those that made the work happen. Mark has served as a superintendent for 25 years, earning recognition as AASA's National Superintendent of the Year, North Carolina and Virginia Superintendent of the Year, and recipient of the Harold McGraw Prize in Education. He was the first in the U.S. to lead a district-wide laptop initiative and helped shape national conversations on digital equity and student-centered learning. Presidents, governors, and giants of Silicon Valley like Steve Jobs and Tim Cook sought his counsel. But what makes Mark an awesome person isn't his resume. It's his unwavering belief in the potential of every child. I'm looking forward to sharing this episode with you because although many of you might know Mark and his accomplishments well, I think there are some pieces about his background and the way he learned and grew up that you'll find surprising. In this episode, we talk about growing up in the American South, confronting racism as both a student and a superintendent, and what it takes to lead a system-wide change with compassion and courage. Mark opens up about his time at Mooresville, where he inherited a district flagged for institutional racism and helped transform it into one of the most admired school systems in the country. He also shares his reflections on Canadian education, which he's long admired for its commitments to inclusion and care. We also discuss his new book, co-authored with none other than Michael Fullen. It's called Spirit Work, The Science of Collaboration, and it's certainly well worth the read. This conversation is filled with heart, wisdom, and an unflinching look of what real education leadership requires. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Mark Edwards. Dr. Mark Edwards, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you. Glad to be here.
Mark, let's start with where does this podcast find you?
In beautiful Nashville, Tennessee, the home of country music. Music City, USA.
I've always loved my time in Nashville, and always want to come back. I've got to come down to visit you one of these days.
Let's plan on it.
Well, Mark, like we always do on the podcast, let's give the audience a sense of what you're up to these days, and maybe a quick note about your background. I would have given you a proper introduction at this stage, but maybe just give them an update as to who you are and what you're up to now.
Sure. Well, I'm Mark Edwards, Nashville, Tennessee, and a lifelong educator. I came from a family of educators. My mom and dad were both public school educators, and I guess early on in my life, I just had this sense of the importance of education, and but it was real. I mean, when I was in elementary school, I thought, well, I'm going to either be a teacher or maybe a principal. I'm going to do something that, and both my parents were really super dedicated, and I really admired it. And they enjoyed what they did. They both enjoyed. My dad ultimately became a college professor, but my mom taught school for 40 years, and I just remember her energy when she had been teaching for 40 years. She was still just on top of her game, and so that a big influence. And I spent time in teaching, coaching. I loved sports, loved coaching, but I also knew that long term, I don't think it was the right route. So got into teaching, and then got into administration really early. I became I think I was 27 and became an assistant principal. 29 became a principal, and didn't know what I was. I know I didn't know what I was doing. But I had the sense. My first day on the job, I think the youngest staff person in the school. But I called up my mother and I said, I know I'm supposed to be ready, but I'm not sure what to do. And she said, well, let me give you some quick advice. Go into every classroom every day and just thank every teacher. I said, that's it. She said, yeah, that's it. Just do it every day. They may or may not understand, but just do it. And so I started doing it. And I remember it was a pretty big school. And I remember after a while, somebody said, are you going to do this every day? I said, yeah, I'm just going to come in and tell you thank you. And I like the students to hear it too. And I did that for my entire career, from a principal to superintendent. And I remember when I was superintendent in Henrico County, Virginia, we had 72 schools. And to visit 72 schools and visit every classroom, it took me the entire year. And my assistant would keep a chart for me so I could see where I've been. But when I think back, that little visit, and it went from mainly just saying thank you for what you do, but then the other thing was acknowledging people. And when I look back, that was the first thing I learned to do. It was the most important thing I learned to do in my career. And I spent time in 3 different districts as a superintendent, and enjoyed that work. So but I also I was an elementary principal, and I just loved that job. I used to just think I am the luckiest. And I also think when principals really like what they're doing, the kids know it, and they also know it about teachers. And so if teachers and the administrators, the students are having fun, they think, well, I guess this is a fun place. But if people are always wigged out or stressed or tense, and I remember I'd eat with kids all the time, and I used to really enjoy. I'd ask them, what do you think about this teacher, that teacher? Lots of times they just tell her to relax, to chill out just a little bit.
That's great. And I know you have got some really amazing stories, and quite frankly, unique stories about your journey in education and the amazing work that you've done. But I didn't realize that we also shared that we were both raised by educators. One a university professor and a college professor, I guess. And your mom was an elementary school teacher.
She was an elementary science teacher, and
cool.
Loved it. And I became a science teacher, and my dad was a science teacher.
We definitely share that experience. So can you tell the audience, let's start. Where and when did you grow up?
Well, I grew up. I grew up in several states, but primarily I would say North Carolina and Tennessee, and lived in fairly rural areas. I really great fondness for both states, and I ended up working in both states, and loved it's interesting. When I was growing up, it was a long time ago, but we didn't spend a lot of time inside. I remember just going, my little brother and I, we'd hit go outside, and we lived in an area, it's kind of suburb, but we could go anywhere. It was perfectly safe. And we were in creeks, we were in the woods, we were making dams, we were doing all kinds of stuff, but just loving it. And then as later on, as I got into sports, we were, always running around to somebody that trying to find the best basketball goal in the neighborhood. But really enjoyed that. And in our neighborhood, we played football, basketball, baseball, and we had an eternal baseball game that the game would start sometime during spring training, and we would keep that same game going through the entire summer. And we actually kept score. So at the end of the season, it was,
That's amazing.
79 to 32.
That's awesome. What do you remember first really loving to learn?
Well, I had a teacher named Jan Wyrick when I was in the third grade, and influence and just a real kind, sweet person. But I knew that both of her sons played. This was in Knoxville, Tennessee. Both of her sons were star athletes at Central High School. I attended West High School when I was there, but I was so impressed to know that she was their mother. She would occasionally, not much, but occasionally, but she encouraged me so much. And she just, said, you can do this. And she loved history and geography things. So she was an influence. And then a couple of years later, I had a teacher by the name of Sue Walker, I had several great teachers, but I'd probably say she was the greatest. And she just had a touch with every kid. And I remember one time we took it's like a semester test. And she was a history teacher. She loved it. And I loved history. And I think on the test, I made 92. And she was calling up every student. And then she'd spend just, 90 seconds going over it with them. So as I was walking up, I said, well, I bet she's going to say, Mark, I'm really proud of you making the 92. And so I went up and she said, Mark, I'm kind of disappointed in you. And I said, why? And she said, I thought you'd make 100 on this test or 98. And she said that, and I think if you really apply yourself, you can do that. But keep up the good work. Have a seat. And I remember, you know what? I'm gonna do better. And it just motivated me. She also I moved to another city, or my family did. I didn't move, but she kind of stayed in touch. And when I graduated, I don't know how, but when I graduated from high school, she found out and wrote me a note several years later. And then when I went to the University of Tennessee, and I think I called her one time, but then she immediately said, I want to invite you for dinner. And her husband was our dentist, but she was just such a fantastic teacher. And for me, history was just like one great story. She would just, oh man, I love hearing about that. And I ended up, she motivated me so much that, and this will date me, but I started reading World Book Encyclopedia. And that was for our family, it was a big deal getting a brand new set of World Book Encyclopedias. And I can honestly say, I think I read I just started reading them. Instead of watching TV, I would rather just go sit somewhere. And I wouldn't read every page, but if anything that interested me, I wanted to read it. So I became, in geography, history, and science, but particularly geography and history, it wasn't like I had any innate ability around it, but I read all these biographies. I read all about every country in the world, and I just loved it. So, but I think that having appreciation for and I had great teachers all the way, all public school, and not schools that were necessarily noted for being outstanding schools, but I had great teachers all the way through. And I had a high school history teacher, Jackson Lee. I love that guy. And he loved history. And he knew it. I was marveled that he would have the textbook in front of him, but he never looked at it. He knew the textbook. And I just thought, wow. So I have to say it was an experience that I loved every day going to school. I hardly ever missed. And I wanted to go. I wanted to see what was going on. And I had fun with it and enjoyed it. And I also I played sports and enjoyed that. And it was motivational for me. And, but I have to say it formed both a belief and a conviction that I have for public education. And go ahead.
Sorry, Mark. Is there anything about your early life and early education that you wish every kid could experience?
Well, I wish every kid could have gone to a school like Pleasant Ridge Elementary. And I guess it was seeing kids that it was a blue collar kind of school. And there were kids from poverty backgrounds in it, but there was such a sense of respect for everybody. And I remember the teachers. There was, I remember one family that was extremely poor. They didn't have running water, and we all knew that because we could see where they lived. And they would go down to a creek and fill up buckets and walk buckets back up to their house. But the faculty members had such respect for that family. And they came to school every day in clean clothes, not basically the same thing. But I remember thinking that was, it wasn't like I was sitting around with some appreciative scholar, but innately I just knew and the first time I do recall the first time that I ever saw overt racism. And I was a freshman in high school. It was a basketball practice. And one of the coaches used a racial slur. And I was so mad. I couldn't believe it. And I couldn't believe. I said, how could a coach use that? How in the world? I went home. My dad taught at that school for a while. And I said, Dad, I can't believe it. And he said, well, it's a shame. And he said, that person should be ashamed of themselves. And I remember it really bothered me. And I talked to the head coach about it. And he said, that's wrong. And I said, that's right. It's wrong. And we can't. So it also helped me when I was coaching, because every kid. And then later on in life, I've written 4 books. My first book was titled Every Child, Every Day. And that to me, that was the best kind of, you say what you're playing. That was it. Every child, every day. Good plan. But
your family was from the South for a long time.
Yeah. Now my dad grew up in Pennsylvania and Maryland, and my mom grew up in Virginia. And all my dad and all his brothers served in World War II. They all served overseas. He served in France and actually was a sergeant, but he had a small group of prisoners. It was toward the end of the war that he told me about. But they both had a real appreciation for everyone. They believed in Christian ethics, and they early on, I can remember my dad. This was an indelible memory. It was 1963. Martin Luther King was preparing for the March on Washington, the Poor People's March. And my dad was working at University of Tennessee, and he got connected supporting families coming from Mississippi on the way up to Washington. So we had 2 families actually probably 2.5 families that scheduled to stay with us. They're African American families from Mississippi, and in 1963, that it was still a largely segregated community, particularly in the South. But it made such impression on me, and that my parents, they just said, everybody, you have to have that sense. And they modeled that in their work. They were both, and then my dad, he went on after he retired, and he immediately became the county chairman for Habitat for Humanity. And he went to a little country church, all good Methodist, all good Tennessee, and recruited men mostly in their 70s and 80s to build houses. And I got recruited, and I got to help. But I think he built 8 or 10 houses, led the building, and then eventually they named a road after him in Cookeville, Tennessee, called Bill Edwards Lane. And my dad was the least. He would never do this podcast because he would never talk about himself. He just wouldn't. Now my mother would, but my dad was, just what you do. And so I still to this day, somebody said, who are your best teachers ever? Well, my mom and dad were my best teachers by far.
Yeah, and I would concur. I'd like to linger on that just another moment longer because of everything that the culture has gone through, collective culture, society, or since COVID, this kind of really ugly rearing of its head of racism. So I think it'd be interesting for the audience to know someone who's grown up in the South. So you have that visceral reaction to overt racism that you experience. To have that reaction, was race something that you and your family talked about when you were young, or was it just a model of how they treated everyone around them?
We talked about it, and my parents just always, they knew, and we were associated with some families who were racist. We knew it, they knew it, and but they always were a guiding sense of you respect all people. And they talked about that. And so growing up, that was just how, we said, of course. And then, if we saw racism, and we all saw it, but I would hesitate to ask us, what do you think about that? And say it's wrong. One time we'd been up the Smoky Mountains. We were driving back through a little community or towns in Tennessee, and there was a whole bunch of cars parked on the side of the road. We thought first an accident, but as we got up closer, we saw a great big cross burning in a field. It was a Ku Klux Klan meeting. And my dad pulled over on the side of the road, and they had loudspeakers so we could hear. And we listened to just a few minutes. And my dad started the car, and we pulled away, and he said, you only have to hear a couple words there to know that's just pure evil. That is nothing but pure evil. So that translated throughout my life as an educator. I became devoted to being an advocate for all children. And I also knew just from life experience that kids that needed the help the most lots of times were the least likely to get it. The kids that might not have running water, they might smell bad. There's a man that doesn't mean anything about their character, or somebody who will look different. And I also, when I was in college, I wasn't sure, I hadn't really said I definitely wanted to be an educator. I was kind of figuring it out. I thought I might want to be a coach, but my best friend was majoring in religious studies, and he convinced me to take a couple courses, and I did. The next thing I know, I was majoring in religious studies, and we had a department chair at the University of Tennessee by Dr. Stan Lusby, who was so wonderful. I used to feel like every class I'm getting to go meet with Jesus. And, I really, we just loved this guy. And But I took a lot of courses, but one course was religion and racism in America. And that's when I first really learned that the most segregated hour in America is between 11 and 12 on Sundays. And then I became more knowledgeable of the history of racism in the country. So in fact, and then also when I was a senior in high school, I went to work for it. I was trying to earn money to go to college, and I was working for a book company called Southwestern Book Company out of Nashville. And you'd go traveling all over the South, college kids mainly, selling books and mainly selling dictionaries. Well, I was sent to Mississippi, Meridian, Mississippi, and I started trying to sell dictionaries. And I'll tell you, the market for dictionaries wasn't real hot. But while we were in training, we had also had a 2-hour session that if we wanted to, we could sell ebony pictorial history of Black America. And one day I said, this community I'm selling these books in, there's a lot of African American. I'm going to try it. And every single house I went to said, I want to order those books because they'd never seen them. It's 1971. There was not and the influence. It thrilled me to do that work. But I learned a lot because it was a 3-volume set of 2,000 pages. It was a pictorial history, but really I understood and developed a knowledge of Black history in America, and it helped me throughout my career. And also just always, I was in a lot of poor homes, but I was so impressed with the pride people I had. And I guess also, Jason, one of my very best friends in my life was the guy that I played basketball with. And he and I were close friends. And his family was, most people would call him poor. They didn't have much. His mother worked it was a domestic, but she worked as a maid. And his dad repaired shoes. And I saw racist behavior toward him. And I used to, I would get angry enough to get physical if somebody was, I nominated him for a club one time and somebody used a slur, and I'm not proud of it, but I got up right away and went over and, did something I shouldn't have done. But I also felt like, there's just no place. So throughout my career, that's something that I'm really proud to be a part of school systems and schools where we've really endeavored to make every child feel welcome. And ultimately, I guess kind of the penultimate thing that happened years and years later when I was a superintendent in Mooresville, North Carolina, when I first started in that district, my first week on the job, the local NAACP officers came by and said, hello, I'm glad to meet you. And they said, we're glad to meet you, but we hate to inform you, but we're filing a class action lawsuit against this district, and we're going to shut it down for institutional racism everywhere. And they gave me a folder. I said, well, I've got a favor. They said, well, I said, how about giving me a couple of weeks here before you shut it down? And let me take a look at it. So I read it, studied it. A couple weeks later, met with them. I said, I understand why you're doing this, but I think we can make some major changes here. They trusted me and said, okay, I'll give us a go. And I think at that time, the graduation rate for African American students was about 40%. 67 for all students. And the achievement levels were really horrific. 5 years later, the highest performing group of students in the state of North Carolina on the 3rd grade reading test were the African American male students in Mooresville, North Carolina. and there was a state Supreme Court decision called the Leandro decision there to guard against institutional racism. But the judge that controlled that asked me to come down and meet with him. And I did. I remember I forgot what with him. He had a reputation as a real tough guy. But when I came in and we talked through some stuff and everything, but then he said, "This is just a great day of joy for me," because he said, "There's nothing special about your district's one of the lowest funded districts in the state." And he
Mark,
said,
can we dive into that a little bit more? Because I think there's a really instructive point that I think I can learn from, and probably the audience too. So, like, you grew up and you have this very, like sort of the good Christian upbringing where they teach you about, equality amongst people and the Christian ethic. And so you have this visceral reaction when you experience racism. Then you become the superintendent at Mooresville. And I do want to talk about your journey a little bit more, but let's just go right to Mooresville here. And the system, the institution is racist. Can you describe like what your experience with that is? Like how an institution, how institutional racism exists? Because I don't think a lot of people understand how, despite its leader being somebody like you who's advocated for equality and respect amongst all people, then inherits a system that behaves in a certain way. And then most importantly, how you change that system.
well, I think that, one of the things that I observed early is that when you hear the term "these kids," it's a pejorative term, and it was used anytime you were talking about African American or poor kids. These kids can't. And I knew better. I mean, I didn't even have to meet the kids. And I would hear, I listened, I went around and met with principals and the community, and I listened. I didn't go to instruct. I went to listen. I just said, "Tell me about things here." And then would say, "Well, tell me, why are so many kids doing so poorly in some areas?" Well, as I would hear the stories, I knew, this district, there was a lot of evidence of some institutional racism. And it was just teachers who did not believe that children who had darker skin could learn as much, and then if you looked at the track record, and then what the NAACP had such vibrant evidence is that the African American students represented 30% of the student body. The suspensions in the district were 75% African American. What's up with that? And then they would also say, "Well, this student did this, and this was their punishment. They stayed one day in after school detention. African American students did the same thing. And they were suspended from all school for 2 weeks." And so what we did is we started talking about it. And to tell you the truth, we had to make some administrative changes. And I knew it was needed. I knew it was necessary. We did it. And we started really paying attention to how students were learning and looking at their results. And we had enough evidence that we knew we could do good work. And then we promoted that good work and said, "Look what we're doing." And one of the points of evidence, the state assessment system was very rigorous. North Carolina had a system that was considered a pretty strong system. And one of the courses that a lot of kids failed was biology. It was a hard test, but ultimately, and we had some good teachers who did really well, and we had some teachers who did not do well. And I looked at the data carefully, and I remember saying, every African American student who's in this class, they're failing. And you can go right across the hall to another teacher, and they're all passing.
Mm.
And so one of the teachers, she was just outstanding. She grew up there, and she said, we have to believe in the kids, and the kids know if you believe in them. And if you believe in them, then you consistently, they're going to respond. And I said, and that's why all your kids pass. And she said, well, they know I love them.
Mm.
And we would, and interestingly enough, Jason, we had people coming from all over the United States to visit this district. And primarily we moved to a all digital environment in Mooresville in 2007, 8. Third grade and up, every kid had their own laptop. That's one of the things we had to address, a lack of resources and opportunities for students. And it was well documented. And we also endeavored and found a way to provide connectivity to homes. And students responded. Then we started really working hard on training teachers and not just training about the best methodologies, but the best evidence of culture where kids respond. And then then our motto for the district was every child, every day. And then we had, we started living, and, we immediately saw improvement. We saw improvement every way, and our suspension rate dropped like we didn't. I said, when you suspend a kid, nothing good comes from it. But if you sit down and talk with them and figure out what to do next time, then something good can come. So now we had developed some great principals. Current principal in Charlotte, North Carolina, huge district, largest district in the state, came from Mooresville and was an assistant principal when I got there. And she showed immediate evidence that if all the kids were treated fairly and equitably, they're all going to learn. So I think I do think it's prevalent still today. And in recent years, we've seen this reemergence of this hate-filled, and to me, it's heartbreaking. And it's not just, it's heartbreaking, and it's like, I just can't believe it because it makes no sense. But I will say this, about 2 or 3 years ago, I was at a high school reunion, and my best friend that I had mentioned earlier was there, and he was captain of the basketball team. He was a year older than me, but we'd stayed friends, and he's now a minister of one of the largest churches in Nashville. He grew up as from very, very modest home, wonderful parents. I knew his parents. My parents knew his parents. But we were talking at this reunion, and this is it kind of answers your initial question about how do you know? I said, Robert, when we were growing up in high school, did you feel a lot of racism? And he said, there was not one day, not one single day of my high school life that I was not subjected to racism. Not one day. And I remember I said, really? I was surprised. He said, not one day. And he said, and there's not one black kid that went to school there that did, not one. And he said, and you know what? I was the kind of kid that was easy to like. I made good grades. I worked hard. I was quiet. I did what I was supposed to. But he also said, but we knew who the racist teachers were. We all knew. And we would, if you got into one of those classes, don't open your mouth for any reason.
Yeah. And I think that's a powerful story. And I've had friends and colleagues that we shared at Discovery Education to, because of the Canadian context and in GTA, I'm sure it was similar, but really hearing the American experience and those that grew up in the South, even younger than you, right, still told me these stories that are heartbreaking, right? Like experience, and for people of our, socioeconomic status and our race don't experience, and it's hard to envision. But here's the thing that baffles me about this kind of swing of the pendulum back to times that you and I thought were gone, is that, all you have to do is talk to people. Just talk to people on how they've grown up. And, you can't question their experience, especially when, so many African Americans, Black Canadians are telling you this was my experience, and they all overlap. So I was interested in the systemic piece. And if I heard you right, it's, kind of on two vectors. One, the prejudices of people that you had to go at and retrain and help them understand. And then two, opportunities for all students. Did I kind of capture that right in what kind of makes up systemic racism?
One thing I think it's important to have discussions. And at one point, in order to help the district heal and help it grow, we brought in an expert from Duke. No one asked us to do this, but we thought it would be really valuable on race relations. And it was very powerful. And then we went through a training through a year, and then we had a summer leadership retreat, and we talked about it openly. And then we also translated that. We had a big teacher advisory group, and we talked about it. And I remember we're having it said, if you learn from dialogue, and we would have, and I remember the conversations didn't come easy. And then I remember we were in a meeting, there were probably 50 teachers there. They were all teacher leaders, but one teacher got up and said, I grew up here in Mooresville, and I've always loved this community. And I was treated well, and everyone else was treated well. And so I don't understand discussion about racism. And she wasn't ugly. She just said it like that. Well, then another teacher got up, Simone Graham, who was the science teacher, biology teacher at the high school I told you about. And she got up and she said, I experienced racism every single day of my life. Now, there's a big difference between the previous speaker and her. Simone was African American. The other teacher was white. And she said, and I'm not challenging you from your experience, but I am saying it was a total different, but it was very, I think we grew as a district, we grew as individuals. And today, that same teacher, Simone Graham, is the principal of Mooresville High School, the first African-American principal ever at Mooresville High School, and is doing an outstanding job.
I would love to have that principal on, and maybe you and I can have a conversation with her, because not a lot of folks know this, but the podcast Education Matters was very much inspired by a book by Cornel West called Race Matters. And my approach here has been to, in some ways, take the way he's thought about that and apply it to education. So this has been a very interesting topic I'd love to explore further. But I also want to spend some time talking about your pretty unique experiences. I don't know, the folks that are part of the audience, I know your work will know this well, but others might be surprised to know that in your work, you cross paths with the White House, and you advise the White House at different times, the Department of Education, but as well as Steve Jobs and Tim Cook, because you were doing some really innovative stuff. Can you give an overview of that aspect of your work for the audience?
Sure. When I was a superintendent in Henrico County, Virginia, it's Richmond, Virginia, in a large district, and it's the state capital, but we had a real, the district was about 50-50 black-white. Most of the African-American schools, high poverty. And there were a lot of issues, but one was equity, just not having the same resources at home. On one end of the county, all students had access to technology. Other end, none did. So we decided that a way to address this, and a lot of different things, was to go digital. And we started this discussion, and initially, that discussion led us out to meet with Steve Jobs in Cupertino. And he said, I've been waiting a long time. I won't use the exact vernacular, but it was, I remember, but he just said, I've been waiting a long time to find somebody it was a large district, but in 1999, 2000, we deployed 37,000 laptops back before, it was the first large deployment of its kind in the United States. And later on, a year later, Angus King, who was the mayor, now the senator of Maine, but then was governor, sent a team to Enrico, and then they were the next, and they did a laptop for all seventh graders in the state of Maine at the time. It was smaller, so big, but that was, we had a lot of challenges, a lot of issues, but we worked through it. And I'll have to say, Apple, Steve Jobs, Tim Cook, all were part of finding solutions. We made things work and grew from it, and then had a lot of attention about it because it was the first of its kind. And after 2 or 3 years, we started seeing the productivity go up, but we also were very resolute in our leadership team around using data and information. So our academic performance grew at the same time. So we became a district, high performance district. The district had been a high performing district, but we went even higher. And in 2004, every single school in that district was fully accredited with a new, very, very rigorous assessment system. And we were the first district in the state to have every school accredited. We were the first district in the state to have all inner city schools accredited. And so and I would attribute that to lots of outstanding leaders, principals and other leaders, assistant superintendents. But Apple was proud of it. A lot of people want to model after it. At that time, George Bush was president, and his national director of technology was very interested, came to visit us, and we ended up doing some work together, writing the educational technology plan. Rod Page was the Secretary of Education, but had some real strong work. And even I was invited for President Bush to come when they were rolling out No Child Left Behind. And even though it was very controversial, and most of my colleagues were not in favor of it, and I wanted a lot of modifications, but I said to myself, I've never really paid attention to how all students were doing. I knew that if we overall were doing pretty good, but the onus on No Child was every child. So we had no choice. We had to follow, but I thought that there was some good rationale, and that the best thing to do is try to help modify it to make it work. But that worked well. And then later on, I served 10 years in Henrico County. And by the way, as a note, I think the audience will find this kind of interesting and noteworthy. The last time all schools were accredited in that district was the last year that I worked in that district, 2004. So since then, they have not had the same results. But later on, I ended up doing I became a dean at a university. But then, and it was a great experience, but I went back into the superintendent work in Mooresville, North Carolina. And in a period of years, that district, and we went all digital, and the district became a model for the country on achievement, because we had incredible achievement at all levels, all courses, just about any graduation rates, it's all kinds of things. And at that time, President Obama, Tim Cook, there was just a lot of interest. Arnie Duncan, Karen Cater, who was the National Director of Technology. And so I had a chance to work with the Obama White House and Department of Education on a variety of things, initiating the initial development of the League of Innovative Schools and Digital Promise. I was involved with that, and I would salute the work. And one story, Jason, I love to tell: President Obama and Artie, they had decided to come to Mooresville, North Carolina, to roll out an announcement on broadband access. We've been working on it for months. I had been invited up to the White House to work on it, some dialogue, and made the choice to come to Mooresville, North Carolina, which we were thrilled. And that year, and at that same time, I had been named the National Superintendent of the Year, and the president recognized that, and it was just a huge honor of my life, just something that I'm proud of, and also knew that we had been involved with some really good work, and we had the president spoke, and he was we couldn't get all the kids in the gym, and as we were walking in, he flew in on their helicopter one. We had to take the goalpost down so they could land in the football field. And he walks in. By the way, they had enough threats that they had snipers in the trees in case there was going to be an issue. But anyway, we were walking in, and I said, Mr. President, I want to tell you something. About 300 kids couldn't fit in the gym, and they're in the cafeteria. And we're going to walk right by that cafeteria. And I asked earlier if you could stop there. And some of your staff said there wouldn't be time for it. But I think we have time. And he said, let's go right to that cafeteria right now. And he walked in, and the kids were, oh my gosh, thrilled. And he went around and shook 50 hands, 60 hands. And they were going to be able to, we had TV set up so they could see it, but he still made sure he did that. And I thought, that's a good leader. Then, after everything was over, he said, well, this has been great, and I've got another meeting. I got to get back to Charlotte, get on a plane, get out of here. Got something West Coast. And he said, what are you guys doing the rest of the day? I said, well, Artie is going to meet with about 6 or 10 of our greatest teachers. And he's got a couple staff, and he wants to ask them questions and brainstorm. And the president said, boy, I wish I could stay. I would love to do that. Because he was asking me questions about professional development. What are you all doing to do this? And I remember thinking, man, this guy knows. So we started this meeting, and Dr. Crystal Hill, who is now the superintendent in Charlotte, was one of the leaders talking, and Artie was making notes. She was telling me, then the door opens, and there's the president. And Artie said, I thought you had to get to that meeting. He said, I postponed it. I wanted to be in this meeting.
So he actually stayed.
He walked in, he stayed. He took his coat off, rolled up his sleeves, sat at the table. And then he said, okay, look, I know this is easy to say, Artie, everybody just relax. And let's just keep the conversation going. And one teacher was crying because she was actually Dr. Hill. This is because she was so moved. But he sat and asked 6 or 8 of the best questions I've ever heard, and took notes, had a little notebook, took notes. And I remember what a powerful impression as a leader. I remember every teacher that was there, he had a photograph made and sent it to him.
That's wonderful.
Just some really cool stuff.
So, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about what's going on right now with the Trump White House and the attempt to get rid of the Department of Education. Can you give us your thoughts on that? And, maybe start with what kind of, detriment that will be to students and kids everywhere. And then, maybe what opportunities actually exist to combat it or fortify the work that you guys do nationally.
Well, Jason, it's been on my mind a lot, and I'm heartbroken about it. And it's interesting. I know, as most superintendents have a pretty good understanding of what the Department of Education does. And over the years, the Department of Education, when they were following up on concerns that community or citizens had offered, sometimes where I was superintendent, they weren't coming in and saying, well, we're so glad. They were coming and said, we have concerns and issues from your community that we need to address. So I had seen their work, but I also know that they were the first advocates for really to enforce civil rights, that children would have equitable opportunities. And to me, that is real important. They're also real important on making sure that female students had the same opportunities for co-curricular activities, did a lot of things like that. And then I worked with departments under President Bush, both Bushes, Clinton, and then Obama. And so my greatest concern, though, has to do with what the department does for special education and for special needs students. And in my family, we have a grandson who is a special needs person. He was born a child born with Downs. And I always took great pride in supporting special education, special needs, but I did not understand until this little guy was born. I didn't really understand the gravity of what the world looks like for families and for students who have special needs. But without the Department of Education, the number one thing that I admire is what they do for kids who don't have support or have special needs. And they enforce it, but it's also funding. And so when I hear about not just the cuts to the Department of Education, but the resources associated with that, to me, it's just heartbreaking. And I'll be honest with you, Jason, I'm in my lifetime, I've always been proud to be an American. I won a big essay contest when I was in the 8th grade, and the title of it is What It Means to Be an American. And I wrote it, it was a school project, but I wrote it at home. And I didn't ask for anybody. I just wrote it from my heart, but I knew what it meant. And I'm really worried, sick about the devolution of our democracy. And everything that all the things that I believed in my whole life, I think are being threatened. And I know what it's not just the Department of Education, but Medicare. So all these things, all these social institutions that are why we are. So I'm very concerned about it. I to tell you the truth, I have struggled not falling into a rabbit hole of depression about the whole situation. And as you know, I've worked with a co-authored a couple books with Michael Fullen, who's been a Canadian hero of mine my whole life, or most of my adult life. And, even a few years ago, he and I were talking during the pandemic, and to me, it's with great sadness that I see what's going on. And the only thing I can hope is that with time, we will see some change and we can come back together. But right now, I think we're in a world of trouble. And, one thing I learned, I had a chance, you and I both worked with Discovery Education, Discovery Canada, and I got to travel around Canada and in several different provinces and different places. And I was out, and I can't remember I think it was Surrey district.
Yep.
But I remember being in a school where they had a program called Kindness Counts. And I remember walking around that school. And that we asked students, they said, well, either once a week or once a month, we have a day where we talk about kindness. These little fourth graders, and I thought, wow. and they were saying really powerful things, strong things. I thought, man, this is so wonderful. I took a photograph. They passed around from class to class a trophy, and it said kindness counts. And I passed it around, and I thought that's to me one of the best indications of what education's all about. It's about math and science and other things, but it's also about how we live.
Mm.
And so I remember that it just struck me greatly, and it's real powerful. And I've told the story because the kids, when they were talking about it, it wasn't like, it was real. And they understood it. They understood that if we're kind to each other, and this was a school of great diversity. And yet there was this sense we all belong here. We're all here. And I think that's when I see what's happening with divisive, hate-filled language, it's just counter to everything I think as Americans, as citizens, we should believe in. And I truly believe this. You and I've talked about this before, Jason. I'm a huge fan of Margaret Wheatley, a great author who wrote Leadership in the New Science, and she's written several wonderful books. She's a great philosopher, but when she wrote Leadership in the New Science, now that she wrote that book back in the 90s, but I read that book and I read it a second time, and I came to a section, and she's a quantum physicist, but she writes about it's a science, but also a philosophical thing. And I remembered it. They were discussing the powers of the universe. And she said the most powerful force in the universe is love. And love can move mountains. And I remember saying, that's it. That's it. And I had a chance to get to know her. Dr. She actually wrote the foreword for that book, Spirit Work. So I really do believe that it is the key. And to this day, I think there's a lot of ingredients, but when children, whether they're 6 or 18, are in a loving environment where there's a consistent sense of you're going to be cared for, it's just so powerful. In Mooresville, we had an alternative school of about 100 students, 50 to 100 students, most who had some legal issues. A lot of them had probation officers. And when I went out to visit the school, the principal was a great principal. And I said, so he was telling me that I had probation officers. He goes, but no, he said, let me tell you something. These kids are good kids. You just have to look, they'll put up this veneer. They'll act tough to you, but I know them. And you get beyond that, and they're just like all other kids. And so I remember we walked right up, and you could tell he had that immediate rapport. Then they kind of showed a little bit of toughness. But as time went on, I learned this guy was such a fantastic principal. And this is the school where the kids who had been disruptive almost every other place they'd been would come. And he created a culture, and the teachers there believed in those children. And I think they had typically around 30 to 40 kids eligible to graduate. Mm-hmm. And he had 100% graduation rate at that school, I think, for 8 straight years. And he would say, we love them across that graduation line. That's how we get them there. We love them across the line. And
that's a beautiful idea. And I think, Mark, it's a good segue to talk a little bit about the book. As those watching on YouTube can see here, there's a wonderful kind of caption of the book, and it says, "Spirit is the essence of character, of what it means to be human." And I think that's a wonderful idea. Can you describe in greater detail the essence of the book?
Sure. And again, I salute my colleague, Michael Fullen, who I also know would be a fantastic guest on Education Matters. But we had written a book a few years previous to that called Unstoppable Momentum. And we were talking during the pandemic about, what's going on. And we both kind of came up with this idea. And initially we were going to call it, I had this idea of Big Spirit. And Michael and Margaret Wheatley have had a lot of association and work with indigenous tribes in Canada. And as we learn more about the native Canadians and the tribal knowledge, we learned that Big Spirit is a deity in certain tribal nations. So we changed it to Spirit Works, but I think both Michael and Margaret Wheatley both had some contact with a chief of one of the nations. And he said, I love the idea of the book. And the Spirit Work is about teaching love, care, kindness, thoughtfulness, and graciousness. And in the book, we feature several districts where you see examples of that. And then the other end of it is the science of collaboration. And it fits perfectly. You create this continuum of love and care and support. And then with that, you build the capacity for people to work together. And one of the things that I learned in Henrico County and Mooresville, that students learn best when they're learning together. And they should be talking all the time in school. When you go to a class, always talking to the teacher and say, wow, it's a lot of missed opportunity. And people would be fascinated because they'd come to visit classes in Mooresville and they would say, I don't see the teacher. I saw the teachers while we were there working. But it was this sense, creating this sense of continuous dialogue where kids really are learning to collaborate. They're learning to do what they're doing. And it was fascinating. We used that work as a model, but then we went to several districts around the country where we saw phenomenal work going on that was exemplars of spirit work and the science of collaboration. And some really great districts from California, from a district from North Carolina, districts from Kentucky, from Memphis, Tennessee, and every one of the leaders from Virginia, Aaron Spence up in Virginia Beach at the time, now he's in Loudoun County. But every superintendent there led with this sense of spirit. And I know Susan Enfield was one of was a superintendent in one of the Highline districts in near Seattle. And her theory and the district's theory was we need to know every child by their name and not just knowing them by their achievements and by their needs. And it was just, it was real simple, but real powerful. And so in each of the districts, John Malloy, who was superintendent in Toronto for years, went out to a California district and he brought some of that Canadian sense of efficacy for everybody and used that to build that district. So the book is really about exemplars of creating the conditions around spirit work. And I really believe that the best opportunities for children are when they know they're safe, they're secure, and they're cared for. And I've had a lot of great opportunities in my lifetime and a lot of great experiences, but none greater than seeing children succeed, and children that maybe some people didn't believe in them, and then they showed they could do great things. And I think that there's one of the great thrills of being a teacher, or being an educator, seeing children succeed. And I'm real lucky because I've worked in environments where I've got to see lots of children succeed. And there's a young guy that, well, he's not young anymore. When I was, I'm trying to think how old Ricky, there's a student, we set up a mentoring program in Mooresville. They had a lot of students who didn't have sometimes a meaningful adult. And so we would mentor children and try to do it over time. Well, I started mentoring Ricky, I believe, when he was in either first or second grade. And he came from a real tough background, and his dad was incarcerated at the time. And he since is out now, and I've had a chance to talk to him. But Ricky was, again, real poverty, not much, but I started reading with him. I knew right away, I said, oh, this kid's smart. He's real smart. And he just took off. And through the years, I'd go by and spend some time with him at the school, usually reading with him. And then I remember one day he said, well, why do you like me? And I said, because you're real easy to like. I said, you're an easy guy to like. And he said, well, I don't know. And he said, I haven't had a lot of people like me. And I said, well, I like you. Well, over the years, we stayed in touch. He was so poor that his clothes literally were, I can't even just, he had a pair of shoes that I don't even know it. They were barely together. But I had, I had a son the same age. So when I went shopping for my son, I'd shop for Ricky. And over the years, stayed in touch with him. A couple times he was going to drop out of school. I had people help me reach out and track him down. And he graduated, defied all odds and graduated. And then, about 6 months ago, he told me one time I'd like to go to college. I said, you can go to college, Ricky. You can go. Hey, you got the ability. And I'll tell you that the teachers and people more really helped him. But he called me up. He said, I just finished basic training, and I've been recommended to go to a special forces unit. And I said, Ricky, I am so proud of you. Man, that's great. And I said, now when you get stationed, get back to me so I want to send you a care package. Because he said, I'm not sure, but I know I'm going to get my orders. And I think, initially you think, well, that's a story about somebody helping a kid. Well, I'll tell you, Ricky did more for me than I did for him. And I think when you touch spirit, your spirit's touched. And to me, that's kind of what that book's about. But I also think I went to Vanderbilt University for my doctoral program, and there was a great teacher there by the name of Terry Deal. It was one of the real, Bolin and Deal wrote a series of books on culture back in the 80s. And I remember Terry Deal was talking in class, and I was just learning about the understanding about culture. And I'll never forget this. He said, culture. Somebody said, what's the definition of culture? He said, well, I like this one. It's, kind of how we do things. It's just how we do things. Mm. And I remember thinking that's a good definition. But I also think it's a combination of how we do things and how we treat each other.
Well, and I think the audience will get, just hearing you tell these, stories after stories of all these people that impacted your life as much as you've impacted them through really, a generous spirit is how I would kind of understand it, and a care for the other. So if you could kind of describe how you and Professor Fullen would recommend a district leader take a step towards the kind of system change that you envision in the book, what would that be?
I think creating conditions for adults to learn together. Mm. And really, I early on, again, had a lot of great leaders in my life that influenced me. But the leadership of learning together. And I remember both in Henrico County and in Mooresville, we did really double down on learning together. And we read books together. And it's something that a lot of people say, oh, I don't, but we did it, and it enriched us, and it lifted us. And we'd spend time each year. We'd select a book that we wanted everybody in the district to read. And one of the books was Six Secrets by Michael Fulton. And when we read that book, it was, we knew this is good stuff. And, of course, I started reading, books by Michael back early in my administrative career. And so he's always been an individual that I admired. And then he came to Mooresville and hung out. And he wanted to talk. He wanted to talk to a lot of people. It was when we were doing our first book, and he was just fascinated. And one of the things, we walked around, and he told me, he said, I know all the kids here aren't gifted, but every single student that I talk to, I would swear they're gifted. And I said, well, Michael, you were right on the second half. They are. They're all gifted. They're not gifted in the sense of some technical definition, maybe, but they all have gifts, and they're all gifted. And so I remember he was just impressed. And I think the whole idea of just, you grow together, you learn together, and then you start applying it. And when we learn how to use information about students, once we figured out that if you really let students understand their own learning, that I remember one great story. We had a lot of thousands of visitors came to Mooresville, North Carolina, which you don't get to by accident. You have to want to go there. And we had some guy I can't remember his name. He was knighted. He was from London. He was visiting. He was a real well-known guy. He was visiting a third grade class. He was walking around. He talked to students. I'm going to think of his name in a minute. But anyway, he was talking to this little boy. He said, what are you doing? He said, well, I'm working on this reading thing. And we read these passages, and then we go to this little testlet, and we get questions, and it figures out, do we really know what we read? So the guy said, well, how are you doing? He goes, I'm doing great. He said, well, how do you know? And he said, well, I'm going to show you. He goes, now, do you understand what a trajectory is? The guy said, yeah, I know. He goes, well, then I'm going to show you my trajectory. He hit a button, and a line goes up. He goes, and you see that little point right there? And he goes, yeah, that's me in September. That's me right there, third grade, first month in reading. You see me right now in March, fourth grade, third month. He said, I'm going to be about fourth grade, 5 months in the year. He said, do you think you can do that? He goes, I know I can do it. He goes, well, how do you know? He goes, I'm in charge of my learning. And everything got real quiet.
Did you pay him to say that? I'm in
charge. No, I didn't. But I tell you what, though, it was just a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
It was just
remarkable.
Just a beautiful thing. I'm in charge of my learning.
For a third grader to articulate it like that obviously shows the care and the work that's being put in. That's fantastic. So, Mark, you've already talked a number of times about like our shared experiences, for example, at our work together at Discovery when I had you up in Surrey. And I know you've done a lot of work with Dr. Fullen, of course, who is, the Canadian educator par excellence. Can you articulate your vision of what makes Canadian education special?
I'll try. One of the things, again, having visited schools in almost every province, that there really is you use this term, generous spirit. I do think that the culture, and it's consistent in almost every place I visited. There was a generous adult presence of care and love. And there was this sense of, I would say there was a sense of well-being of for everyone. And the other thing, I think that there was a sense that everyone was learning together. Everybody, all adults, all students. and growing. And in having worked with primarily leaders in Canada, but they're just, I would describe this a sense, almost the essence of efficacy, where there's really care for everyone. So I've admired Canadian educators, Canadian leaders, and have seen great work. And so I've had a chance to speak to Canadian superintendents through the years, and I've always learned from that experience. But I think there is a real sense of what I call the essence of what education should be, and that is an opportunity for everybody and a sense of respect for everybody. And that's how I describe Canadian education.
Thank you, Mark. My penultimate question. If you had an all-powerful magic wand and you could do anything in your imagination to create a utopian education system, what would you do?
I probably wouldn't do a lot different than what I did in a lot of my career. I do think the magic is the spirit of love, and I don't think there's anything more powerful. So I can't, but once a community embraces that, unbelievable things can happen. And I'll kind of put a little exclamation point on Mooresville. There are 119 school districts in the state of North Carolina, public school districts. And during my 9.5 years in Mooresville, we ranked anywhere from 114th to 117th in funding. We were dead last, one spot away from dead last for the entire time. So a district not noted for having resources. And we didn't have, there were a lot of things we didn't have, but what we did have was an abundance of conviction. And we had incredible academic achievement at every level. And I really believe that the combination of conviction powered by that spirit and love, it created conditions where, I at some, maybe someday I would put up some charts and show, but our people would look at that achievement and they would go, that is amazing. And the achievement was stellar, but what was amazing was that everybody believed in everybody else. The students believed in each other. And this is a little great story about that district too. The students wanted to have what was really big in the Charlotte region was to have these great science fairs and great competitions. And so we were building robotics, and that was a big thing, robotic competition. And we had students who wanted to do it. We never had a team. Schools around us had teams. So we got one of the teachers said, I'll do it. I'll sponsor it. And we started working on it. And they were building their robots, working on it and everything. And we were getting ready to go, and they were looking at films from the previous year of the robotics competition. And these other teams, they had what looked like NASCAR suits, their school with all this stuff, full, all kind of real cool stuff. And one kid said, we don't want anything like that. But the teacher said, we'll figure something out. And it's not what you wear, it's what you do. And I remember I said, well, how are you guys going to do? And the teacher looked at me and said, we're going to win. I said, now, I hope so. But remember, this is your first year. You're going against schools that have been doing this for 10 years. They won. And they won the next year. And then the next year they had two teams that took first and second place. And then they won the next year. And they came up with the most phenomenal uniforms. They all got white T-shirts, and they got a can of blue spray paint, and they spray painted them. and that was their suit. And that performance was so powerful. These are blue collar kids, and I'll never forget this. A couple of years later, I was back. They were getting ready to the competition, and they told me, they said, "Well, we know we're going to take first and second place because we have 3 teams, but our real goal is to take first, second, and third." And that, it wasn't, didn't have big heads. They just had conviction and knowledge. And so when you see things like that happen, it's just the joy. There's huge challenges in education, but there's huge joy. And all teachers who have experienced that joy of seeing a child succeed, it lifts their spirits. And it's something that I think it's not something that goes away. It stays with you. It stays with you. And, I saw, teachers through the years that, I have teachers I haven't seen in 50 years, but they're still with me. They're with me every day. I feel them. I know them. And so I think it's the greatest privilege in the world is to be an educator. It's it is a hard job, but it's so important. And one thing, Jason, about Canadian education, the public and the community, their support is just splendid. It is just, there's this real sense of this is important for our country. This is important. And I think that there's a unified sense of respect and appreciation at a higher level than most places I've ever seen. So that sense of this is important stuff, and we ought to show it.
Well, from your mouth to every Canadian's ears. With that, Mark, the last question is always, do you have a book, a podcast, a video album, music album that you would recommend to the audience?
Yes, I am. I don't have, Michael and I we talked about doing another book, but Michael's written a lot of books. I've written 4, but I'm a huge believer in, I think you should listen to music every day. My mother ingrained that in me, and I've made a real practice throughout my life of listening to music every day. And typically I would play music right now, but I'm going to recommend some very special music. It's by a band called Lanco, Lanco. Their first album went triple platinum in Canada. They play all over Canada. They're from right here in Nashville. It's my son-in-law's group. And they were the new country band of the year in, I think, 2022. And their first album, their single, which is called Great Love Story, went #1 for 17 weeks. And they're just started a new tour and a new album. And it's called We're Gonna Make It. And as a matter of fact, a friend of yours and mine, Andy Schaefer, they were playing in Chicago, and he got to go see them. Also, a friend of mine at a company I work with called Otis, and a great company. And but Lanco is country, and it's fun music. And I hope you'll listen to the album. They have 2 albums out now, and then there's another Canadian band called High Country. And my son-in-law, who's in Lanco, he writes for other groups, and he's had a couple songs for High Country. And I wish I had done this, Jason, but I didn't. He had, my son-in-law, his name's Jared Hampton with Lanco. He had the #1 song in Canada about 4 or 5 months ago, Canadian country music. But I can't remember, the artist is real famous. I can't remember his name. But anyway, Lanco is who I would recommend.
Awesome.
For some great music.
Well, we'll definitely check that out. So with that, Mark, always a pleasure. I feel like you and I can go on here for another few hours, so we'll definitely have to have you back and talk more about all these topics, and maybe we start with music next time.
I think it sounds like a plan. Jason, thank you. It's been an honor to have a chance to be on the show with you, and I think it's important. I think it's important work sharing and growing and learning. I know I've had a chance to look at some other episodes of Education Matters, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing, and I think it's good work.
Thank you, Mark. It means the world. Thank you. This podcast is recorded on the territory and Treaty 13 lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. The show is edited and produced by the marvelous and talented Andrew Mastroianni. If you like what you're hearing, make sure you subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast. Until next time, remember, there's absolutely no inevitability as long as there's a willingness to contemplate what's happening. I'm your host, Jason Bucheri. Until next time.